Welcome back. We are in module 10. We are talking about the conversation skills that children acquire slightly later than the grammatical skills. So far we have discussed about various aspect of communication skills, including implicature, scalar implicature and other types. So, today we will start with yet another important aspect of communication, which is called turn taking. Now, turn taking is an important aspect of communication. In any kind of conversation, you need whether it is a two-party, it's a dyadic conversation or it's a multi-party conversation, depending on the topic, depending on the people involved, there are certain patterns of turn taking that is part and parcel of any kind of successful communication. So, this is not arbitrary, this depends on various factors. So, primarily there are certain things that you need to keep in mind when engaging in any conversation, which is keeping the conversation flow intact, and also it has to be you should not stray too far away from the main topic of conversation and so on. And along with that, there are certain cultural culture specific aspects of turn taking as well. So, we will see some of them and how children acquire them and what are the problems there. So, turn taking is not arbitrary, it follows certain rules, these are culture specific as I just said. So, as a result of which children need to learn a few specific properties of conversation in this regard. What are those? Primarily three. So, first and foremost, paying attention to the topic, that means they have to, if at all they are participating in a conversation, it should not be that they come in with a completely different topic or completely different agenda on their own, rather they have to stick to the topic of the conversation at that given point of time. So, in order for them to make any kind of meaningful contribution to a conversation, they need to pay attention to the topic. Secondly, planning the utterance in a way that keeps the conversation going. This is connected. So, all these three features are connected to each other. You cannot simply say whatever comes to your mind, you have to also plan beforehand, before you interject, before you give your contribution. So, contribution has to be meaningful. Remember, we discussed about the maxims of Grice. So, keeping in mind those things, we are looking at the points here. So, planning the utterance in a way that keeps the conversation going rather than stopping it. Similarly, ensure utterance is both informative and relevant. So, these are the three primary factors on the basis of which children need to learn how to contribute to the ongoing conversation. Now, what are the ways in which we can assess these abilities among children? There are many types of many points of departure to look at it. So, one way to assess is to check whether they are able to offer pertinent information when asked or when they interject something into an ongoing conversation. So, it can be both ways. You can ask the child to contribute, or you can just just interject something into the ongoing conversation. Both ways you can check whether they are able to meaningfully contribute to a conversation, keeping in mind the turn taking as an important variable. So, this skill as a result has been studied from multiple perspectives. For example, answering parental questions. So, whether they can answer questions like whether they are giving pertinent information when asked. So, like that. So, when the parents or any other caregiver or whoever they are engaged in conversation, if they are giving the answers properly and also getting responses to child contributions. Similarly, joining in conversation between other family members, and last, contributing to conversation between parents and an older sibling. So, these are some hypothetical scenarios where children might engage in conversation, might engage in a communication setup of various types. So, either they can be asked a question, or they on their own they join in, and when they join in, there can be multiple types of conversation, maybe with other family members themselves, and then sometimes the parents and older sibling are discussing, the younger child joins in, and how do they join in, whether they come in with relevant information and wait for their turn and so on. So, what do research findings point to? This primarily suggests that conversational turn taking starts at birth. Remember, we talked about the primitives of conversation that or proto conversation skills that develop very early in life. So, this is one of the main findings with respect to this domain as well. So, in the beginning first few months adults govern the conversation because they are the ones talking. The children are infants, they are very small, very young. So, they cannot contribute in a through their verbal output. So, primarily the parent is the person who is talking. So, one of the first studies, we have referred to this study before as well. In this domain they analyzed videos of two mothers indicating interacting with their infants from 3 months of age, that is very early, very young children, and the mother is conversing with the child. So, what they find out was that though they were mothers were the only one talking, they commented upon each output, whatever the output might be. It might be just some vocalization which has at that moment probably not much of meaning, any smile, burp, so on and so forth. So, whatever the child is doing, the mother takes it as an input into the conversation and replies to that. So, there she gives a response to that. So, thereby creating some sort of a conversation, a proto conversation. So, these are the first few steps, first few important stages towards creating a sense of conversation in terms of setting the pattern for turn taking, because each time the child has any kind of response, the mother takes it as his or her turn of speaking. So, thereby this is understood to be creating the foundation for later practices of turn taking in a conversation. Much later in 2005, there were some interesting studies. One of them looked at German mothers with their infants from 1 month to 3 months of age, and what they found out was initially in the first month the mothers seemed to be simply establishing a contact with the infants by using simple sentences, because that is the first month of their life. So, mother is simply creating a bond, simply creating a foundation of the conversation and so on. Gradually, they incorporate longer sentences with more complexity and diversity of words, which is understandable, but this is an empirical study to verify that the mothers do not start with complex sentences or with lots of vocabulary in the initial stages. Initially, they simply stick to very foundational simple kind of sentences. By 3 months, mothers already engage in turn taking, treating the child as partners in conversation. So, this ratifies the older findings. Now, with this we know that infants already engage in turn taking since the very beginning of their life, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. So, they are already able to understand their turn, or at least their parents convey that kind of a sense into them. So, we kind of take it as that they understand, they learn to engage in turn taking of some sort. Now, given that factor, it should be expected that when they grow up, they must be doing very well in turn taking in a conversation. And in fact, some studies actually do support that children even at 2 years are found to be capable of relevant and appropriate contribution in conversation with a caregiver. So, many studies have looked into this. But one of the most important problems here is that most of these cases, most of these studies looked at conversation with a parent. Now, when the child at 2 years they are talking with their parent, the conversation will more or less be smooth, because as a parent they will tolerate a lot of mistakes. So, even when the children are not participating in the exact way they are supposed to, parents do not really mind. So, they ignore and they go on, the conversation continues, and thereby giving it the appearance of a smooth conversation. So, the tolerance for mistakes is much higher when the conversation is with parents, and hence it may not be a very good indicator of the child's ability for turn taking. Now, findings from multi-party conversation provide contrary evidence, because with parents the tolerance level that the parents have may not be always present in a multi-party kind of a conversation. So, in those cases we find opposite result, we find contrary result. For example, an influential study they reported that young children's turns are often irrelevant, off topic and ignored. So, this is a case where it is not only the parents, but there are other people, and in such cases children do not really contribute in the proper way in a conversation. So, they also found that 2-year-olds were less successful while trying to join conversation between their mothers and older siblings. Approximately 50% of the 51% of the intrusions were irrelevant. So, more than half. So, that is a good indicator. The turn taking actually is. So, what is the take home lesson here? Take home lesson is that when they are conversing one to one in a dyadic conversation with parents, they seem to do well, because parents have a higher threshold for tolerance of mistakes, but in multi-party conversations they do not seem to do that well. Another important aspect in conversation is the idea of timing. Timing is like when you take your turn. So, one person has already spoken, the other person has to come in, and the kind of the way you will join in, when should you join in. So, that typically in adult conversation the gap between turns is 250 milliseconds, which is very low. 250 millisecond is what we typically find in adult speech, adult conversation. But the studies have found that in case of conversation with between 3-year-olds like small children, the gap is much longer. This is 1.5 seconds, which means 1500 millisecond. So, you can see the gap is much larger as opposed to the adult conversation. Now, this means that they actually wait for longer time, meaning they are not able to time their contribution in a conversation properly. So, this means that they are not able to anticipate the gap. So, this is in a multi-party conversation, children have been found to have serious difficulties with precise timing of their self selections. So, when they are not only in case of dyadic conversation, but multi-party conversations, they have been found to have serious difficulties while in anticipating and in giving a timely intervention. Similarly, institutional procedures of turn taking, like in school, the conversations are different in terms of when they are happening at home with parents, they are happening in a informal situation with multi-party conversational setting, and similarly you have yet another kind, which is institutional kind. So, in a school setting, for example, there also the conversation will happen among people who are not, let us say, they are not close to the child. In those cases also there have been lot of studies, and similar kind of difficulties have been found with respect to younger children, that they do find it difficult to map the timing in order to anticipate the timing, in order to contribute, keeping in mind the timing and so on. So, typically children have problems with their with planning their turn of the conversation. So, as a result of which, when by the time they actually do contribute, the topic might have shifted. So, in a conversation what happens? You start with a topic and then you gradually build up. So, let us say the child was expected to answer 2 minutes before, and then they finally come in much later. By the time they do come in, the topic has shifted. So, as a result of which many have pointed out that their wrong contribution is actually a matter of wrong timing rather than wrong contribution in terms of content. So, simply because the topic has moved by the time they have contributed. So, the previous finding we saw that they often have irrelevant contribution. So, that is how you can account for irrelevant contribution, because they might simply be late in contributing. Another important factor in conversation is that children do not seem to master the use of words like this. They are called floor holders. So, by using these we mean that the conversation is still going on. You can signal multiple things. You are looking for the exact word, a proper word to explain, or you are still arranging your thought or whatever. There are multiple reasons why we use floor holders. But this typically the fundamental aspect is that we intend the conversation to go on, that I have more things to say. So, that is why it is called floor holder. So, I am holding on there while I come up with the exact sentence or phrase or word that I want to speak. So, this means that the speaker wants to continue this his or her part of the conversation. Now, in case of children, they do not seem to get it, because they do not yet have the understanding of floor holder particles, and they as a result often do many mistakes in this. With caregivers, when in conversation with caregivers, this may not really matter much, because as we have already discussed, that parents have a higher threshold for tolerance of mistakes of various kinds. But in other cases, they do affect the conversational skills, as a result of which the quality of conversation by children suffer also on account of this factor. Thus, the idea that children, infants, even though they seem to show some indication of turn taking quite early in life, it takes many years for them to master it. So, it is one thing to contribute by mere vocalization, mere smile or burp or something like that, but it is completely different to contribute in a meaningful way in a conversation that requires verbal response, keeping in mind all the maxims of Grice. So, for being informative, being relevant, and also so on and so forth. And then you have to couple it with the variables in the conversation, like turn taking, timing, and floor holding, and so on. So, these things, the combination of all these factors do take some time in children to master. Then we also have being informative, which is again another important maxim of Grice. So, do children's first contributions to conversation make sense? That is another important. Is it like they only miss out the timing, or do they also have proper information to share in the conversation? So, this is judged by how informative their contribution is, and also measured in terms of what can be assumed in the context and what cannot be. So, this is what informative being informative means. Are they giving any information when they contribute, and whether that contribution is it already there, is it already can you assume this information already from the context, or whether it cannot be, and so on. So, if the child's contribution is about what is not assumed or not certain in the given context, then only it will be considered an informative content, because if the ongoing conversation has already talked about those things, then there is no point repeating them. So, if children repeat, then it is not informative. If they do not repeat and they give new information, then it is informative. So, for example, the child may or may not be in possession of a toy. Now, when the toy is not in her possession, its identity becomes uncertain in the context. So, in such a case, she has to mention the identity of the object. Remember, we talked about similar ideas with respect to using nouns versus pronouns. So, this is something similar that we are talking about here. So, if there is a toy with her, and the context, if it is not in her possession, then the identity is uncertain, but if it is there in her possession, then the identity is certain. So, in that case, she has to choose the word accordingly in order to contribute to a conversation. So, on the other hand, if she has the toy, it is undergoing some change, she is more likely to mention the change, not the toy. So, for example, the child had the toy, and now the toy is with somebody else, with his or her mother, then she has to talk about that change rather than about the toy. So, this is what we mean by being informative. Thus, children need to be aware of the least certain aspect of the situation in order to make informative contribution to a conversation. So, these are the technicalities about what we mean by being informative. For an adult, this does not require to be said, because we know that the thing that has been already talked about, we need not repeat it if we want to make a meaningful conversation. What we can talk about it is that anything that has happened that is new to the entity, not the entity itself. So, for children this is what we are looking at. So, for different stages of their development, this will refer to different things. So, in the one word stage, this will be visible in naming the object. Are they able to name? As you might have noticed that many of the experiments that we discussed in this course has to do with naming objects. So, this is why we do this. In later stages, in case of longer utterances, it is noticed that children place the known information first and then follow it up with what is new. So, this idea of what is given and what is new is dependent on the speaker's understanding of what the hearer knows. This is also something we discussed in the beginning of this module, that along the conversation, any meaningful conversation depends also on not only what the speaker knows and understands, but also his or her understanding about what the hearer knows or understands. So, it is also dependent on a lot of socio-cultural meta knowledge, extra non-linguistic knowledge. Yet another important factor in conversation is the situation where conversation breaks down, right. So, sometimes conversation does not go forward for various factors, for a wrong contribution, for a longer gap and so on and so forth. So, this also is something that the children need to understand, that the communication has broken down and there are some repair methods that are needed. They need to repair it in order to, for example, the child is expressing something that the caregiver or whoever is the conversation partner fails to understand, fails to follow. Then the child has to repeat his or her utterances or make changes in the utterances in such a way that the conversation goes on. That means, the hearer can understand what she or he is saying. So, conversation skill as a result also depends on the ability to recognize, locate and repair misunderstandings and conversational breakdowns. This is taken for granted in adult conversation, but not so much in conversation with children. However, the findings suggest that children actually become quite adept early in their life about repairing communication. So, whenever there is when it breaks down, they actually are able to repair in their own way, but they do repair. Interestingly, while we are talking about communication breakdown, many researchers have pointed out that it is the point where a conversation breaks down that can be useful for teaching children certain conversational skills that we discussed before. So, the information content, the timing, the turn taking, all of these actually become let us say highlighted when the communication breaks down, when the child realizes, if the child realizes and when the child realizes, this is exactly the point where the child has a window to understand what went wrong and thereby correct themselves. So, learning communication breakdown and repairing them not only teaches them how to repair, how to make themselves understood better, but also in turn it also helps them learn some of the fundamental aspects of communication. So, there have been many studies in this. One of the studies that I have quoted here is when 1 or 2 year olds fail to make themselves understood due to mispronunciation, what they do is their method of repairing is first to try and repeat the utterance. So, typically they will repeat the problematic part that they understand as the problematic one. So, they understand that this is where I have failed to convey what I was trying to convey, and thereby they repeat. This has been found out even in 1 and 2 year old children, which is pretty early in life. As young as 1 year olds reject misinterpretation by adults when they realize that the adult has not got it correct. They have misunderstood the utterances, they actually are also able to reject even when they are just 1 year old. One famous study that I have quoted here is was by Golinkoff 1983. Here Jordan, who is very young, he vocalizes repeatedly until his mother turns around, and then mother turns around to look at him, and then Jordan points to an object on the table. Because this is, remember, this is this is very young child, the language is not yet there. So, he is trying to, he is vocalizing something and pointing to an object on the table. Mother then holds up the milk container. Do you want this? Jordan shakes his head no. Vocalizes again, continuing to point. Mother holds up a jelly jar. Do you want this? Jordan repeats the action as before. So, every time the mother picks up a wrong object, the child keeps on nodding his head to indicate no, his disapproval, and continues to point. And then the few more such kind of offer and rejection follow. Finally, mother holds up the sponge. You want this? Then Jordan leans back in his chair, arms down and relaxed. Okay, finally she got it. So, this is a stage where he is not yet able to speak, he is 1 year. So, that and then through gestures, through various other physical various kinds of body movement and such, they finally they get what they wanted to get. So, they realize that the communication has broken down. In this case, it is a non-verbal communication, and even here the child is able to figure out that communication has broken down and tries to repeat. So, this is often referred to in many of the many later studies as an important pointer, that even a small child at that age, before they have started to speak, they can actually understand when the communication breaks down. Obviously, for older children the strategies will be different, because by the time they are able to speak, they will use language. So, 3-year-olds exhibit an increased repertoire of various kinds of remedial sources. So, they will deploy an answering request for clarification and then revising their utterances accordingly. So, when they are older, obviously they have language at their disposal, and they will use various kinds of clarification request and then repeating their sentence or rephrasing the sentence when they are not able to, when they understand that the communication has failed, and so on. In peer interactions, children between 4 and 6 years manifest their growing concern with the smooth running of interaction, because by the time they are 4 to 6, they are good at conversation, they are able to have proper conversation among their peers, and that is when they are found to be taking this very seriously, and they are actually focusing on keeping the conversation smooth and using various kinds of methods to repair and revise their utterances. Now, this is found that children are, by the time they are 4 years or 6 years, they are quite good at repairing, but there are certain cross cultural differences in this too. So, because why do we need to take into account the cross cultural variation? Because communication as a process is culture specific. The way you converse, the way speaker and hearer interaction takes place in any given scenario is dependent on the way that particular activity is perceived within a culture. So, and this also takes us to the larger social what do you call it, let us say larger social patterns of behavior. So, you have to put it within that entire background. So, this concerns the speakers and hearers responsibilities for securing mutual understanding, that is one domain. So, in a larger socio-cultural backdrop, how people behave within a particular context, and within the context of conversation, who has the responsibility for taking the conversation forward, who has the responsibility for making things understood and so on, that is also something on which cultures, societies and cultures differ. So, typically in western societies, in western middle class contexts, adults repair initiation serve multiple functions like enhancing mutual understanding and implicit socializing procedures. So, in case of western societies, the responsibility lies with the speaker. So, in case of adult conversation, what do they do when they repair their utterances? They are typically keeping in mind the basic factor of mutual understanding, that the speaker has the responsibility for creating mutual understanding and also for implicit socializing procedure. So, what is implicit, what is not explicit, what is just implied, how is the speaker expected to behave in a particular scenario. Keeping all these things in mind, adult conversations use repair strategies typically by the speaker. So, when the in this kind of a social scenario, when the child is speaking, the same responsibility comes to the child. So, as a result, the child has to give the relevant information, and continuously they have to monitor whether the hearer has understood or not. Now, this seems like a commonsensical thing, but in certain cultures this is not exactly so. So, in many non-Western cultures, for example, Japanese have been studied. So, in case of Japanese socializing pattern, there is an understanding of, there is a concept of intent listenership, because in Japanese society, in Japanese conversational setup, the mutual understanding is attributed to the listener, not so much to the speaker as opposed to the Western societies. Here children are expected to develop and deploy interpretive skills and actively signal whether they understood or they did not understand. So, that the onus is on the hearer, on the listener to keep the conversation smooth, not on the speaker. So, if they first and foremost they have to pay attention to what is being said, they are supposed to be able to interpret it properly, and if they do not, they have to signal it to the speaker. So, that is what ensures a smooth conversation in the Japanese society. And then there is another factor that with respect to the repair, this takes place more often with the unfamiliar adults than with the familiar ones, because obviously because with familiar ones, like with parents, parents have a higher threshold for tolerating mistakes. So, their children also understand that. We have already seen before how joint attention develops pretty early in life, and thereby they are actually able to take the position of the hearer and they figure out. So, with parents they do not really indulge so much into corrections, but with unfamiliar adults they do more. Interestingly, in fact, it has been found that even orangutans repair their gesture based on the degree of comprehension by the addressee. So, it is not only the human child, but also primates that have been found to repair their conversation skills. So, to sum up, children are eager to communicate and usually try to achieve their goal, fulfilling the necessary criteria, and baseline is generally created by the time they are 2 years of age, and after that they are simply refining and getting better at it. So, these are some of the variables with respect to turn taking, timing, and repairing when the conversation breaks up. Thank you.